Welcome to this Interagency Standing Committee briefing on pushing forward on women's rights in humanitarian settings. I just want all participants to know we are recording this and this will be made public after the session and posted on our website. So a reminder for those joining online, please, if you can, mute, and we'll make a start. So thank you for spending this next 90 minutes with us. My name is Wendy Q. I am the officer in charge for the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat, and I have the honor to host today's briefing. In keeping with the 2025 International Women's Day theme for all women and girls, rights, equality, empowerment, and its calls for actions to unlock equal rights, power, and opportunities for all so that no one is left behind, the IASC deputies called for a dedicated conversation led by UN Women and the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights on the deterioration of women's rights in crisis settings. As we all know, this is a challenging time for the humanitarian system, with complex crises and escalating humanitarian needs amidst a worrying disregard for international humanitarian law and an erosion of basic rights and protections. There's been a weaponization of sexual violence, impunity for violence against women, and marginalization of women from decision-making spaces. These are all factors that have driven the erosion of women's rights. We've seen this in Afghanistan, where rights and space for women's social and political participation has dwindled. We've seen that girls are currently banned from going to school beyond the 6th grade, and women are restricted from working outside the home in most sectors, or even to travel without a male chaperone. Women human rights defenders face growing attacks, and so-called morality laws introduced in recent months have imposed further repressive measures, and a ban now prevents women from attending private medical institutions, the last remaining sector in which Afghan women could pursue higher level learning. In Sudan, we'll hear more about this later from one of our speakers, there's been a systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, and women activists, especially those who play a leading role in the uprising and continue to advocate for their rights, are often targeted. Female journalists and medical professionals are also targeted. More than 2.5 million girls, representing 74% of school-aged girls, are currently out of school, and this increases their risk to harmful practices such as child marriage and female genital mutilation. Despite reaching the 30th anniversary of the 1995 Beijing Declaration, which was a landmark agenda for achieving gender equality, not a single country has achieved gender equality. Women and girls in crisis-affected settings are most affected by this lack of progress. With persistent discrimination and democratic backsliding, political crises are used to push back gender equality in humanitarian settings. This has been exemplified by the increased use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, attacks against women leaders and human rights defenders, and the promotion of women's rights portrayed as a threat to traditional norms. Today's speakers will outline how this pushback against women's rights is a common thread in the rise of authoritarianism and the spread of conflict and violent extremism across the globe. So I'm very pleased to welcome our panel of distinguished speakers that we're very fortunate and honored to have among us. And I'm going to invite them to put on their cameras so that I can introduce them. We have Ms. Nyaradzi Gomanjanda. She's the Deputy Executive Director for Normative Support at the UN System and UN System Coordination and Results at UN Women. Hi, Nyaradzi. We have Ms. Peggy Hicks, the Director of Thematic Engagement of Special Procedures and the Right to Development Division in the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. Okay. And we have Ms. Hala Al-Karib. She's the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, and she's joining us from Sudan. We have Ms. Ulrika Richardson, the Deputy Special Representative for the Secretary General and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Haiti, joining us from Port-au-Prince. Ulrika. And we have Ms. Wafa Mustafa, who is a Syrian activist and is also the Senior Communications and Advocacy Lead at the Syria Campaign. Following this panel, there will be time for some discussion, and if at any time you have questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat and we will collect them for the speakers. So without further ado, I am honored to invite Peggy Hicks from the United Nations Human Rights Office to speak first. Let me just introduce Peggy with a short bio. Peggy has been providing strategic direction on pressing human rights issues since joining the Human Rights Division in January 2016, including on human rights in the digital age and expanding civic space. Prior to that, she was Global Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch and previously served as Director of the Office of Returns and Communities in the UN Mission in Kosovo and as Deputy High Representative for Human Rights in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She has also worked as a Director of Programs for the International Human Rights Law Group and as a Clinical Professor of Human Rights and Refugee Law at the University of Minnesota Law School. So, Peggy, can you please tell us what are the main trends right now for women's human rights in humanitarian settings?
Great, thank you so much, and wonderful to be with all of you to discuss this important topic today. Thanks so much for organizing it. I don't think I need to tell those assembled that we're witnessing a truly global pushback on women's human rights and gender equality, and it's compounded by other types of restrictions on civic space and increased restrictions on individual freedoms to express, participate, assemble, and associate. We also see additional attempts to pass legislative and policy reforms that go against international human rights norms, and that those are multiplying. I think where we'll start out, though, is that while resistance to this gender equality and anti-gender campaigns is not new, I think we do need to recognize that the content of this resistance and the location is changing somewhat. First of all, these are increasingly prominent, organized, and well-funded efforts to push back on women's human rights. We've seen a rise in populism and fundamentalism and a resurgence of authoritarian, patriarchal, and conservative narratives that reward certain forms of masculinity and that normalize misogyny and gender-based hatred. We see as well that these have spread across regions. We have always seen some engagement in multiple regions, but that it's happening in places where we thought we were making progress and unexpectedly seeing greater pushback. And I think that's part of the sense of urgency that we feel. And then, of course, we've also seen how how social media contributes to this pushback on women's human rights. It facilitates gender-based violence. And that's used to attack journalists, politicians, women's rights activists, and of course that there's an amplification and a spread in terms of numbers and in terms of how quickly it can happen. So that's some of the changes that we've seen in this context. Sorry, I've got something in my voice all of a sudden. We're seeing increasing attacks on women human rights defenders. Women and girls are targeted for expressing their rights to information, expression, and public participation. And what happens in this context is that women themselves are being excluded from participation, and we're not hearing women's voices in public spaces in the way that we used to. I think it's important to say as well that these issues are highlighting sexual and reproductive health and rights. And of course, the rights of LGBTQI plus people are particularly endangered. There's an issue here where, while we're focusing on women's human rights for today, these issues around gender and gender equality and sexual and reproductive health are at the center of the discussion in many senses. And there's a real peril if we kind of divide and conquer around these issues as well. Similarly, we see that. Oh yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry. Your background noise. Was we okay to go forward? Okay. Women are suffering multiple forms of discrimination. Are the ones most affected by this, and I want to move on now quickly to how this plays out in humanitarian settings with 5 particular areas of concern that I'd highlight. Attacks against women human rights defenders, as I've already noted, have been increasing, but those are particularly acute in conflict affected areas where women human rights defenders are exposed to the most significant risks. In 2023 alone, our office documented 41 cases of killings of women human rights defenders in conflict affected countries, which I'm sure is an undercount due to fear of reprisals and limited reporting. The second issue is around gender-based violence, and we've seen a drastic increase in GBV, reflecting, among others, a doubling of cases of conflict-related sexual violence cases documented by the United Nations. We know that rape has always been used as a weapon of war. What we see in Sudan, Ukraine, the DRC, that playing out in tragic ways across those conflicts. And of course, displaced women face higher risks of GBV. So there's a critical component here that has to be part of the humanitarian response. The third area is around sexual and reproductive rights. We know that this is something that is particularly acute in humanitarian and conflict affected settings and disproportionately affecting the most marginalized women and girls. Challenges in supporting access to survivors of sexual violence and conflict to healthcare, such as emergency contraceptive or safe abortion services, are particularly problematic right now and are something that we'll obviously need to look at more closely. Delivery of essential sexual and reproductive health services is unfortunately often deprioritized and underfunded within humanitarian responses. And of course, health workers who are providing these services are increasingly under attack as well. The fourth area is the lack of meaningful engagement by women in humanitarian response and peace negotiations. We know that women's participation in decision-making remains limited in protracted and sudden onset emergency responses. And that's something that, of course, we're all working together to improve those statistics in terms of the women who are present and engaged around peace processes and other participation in humanitarian response, as we've discussed. And the fifth, of course, is a crisis that I'm sure we're all very aware of around the lack of funding for women's rights organizations. They've always been underfunded, but obviously now we're facing real attacks in terms of the amount of funding that's available, given the reliability of key donors is increasingly under threat. And we have all sorts of examples that my colleagues have given to me that we can go back on. So I'll close there. These are some of the main things we're seeing in terms of the trends for women's human rights, particularly in humanitarian settings across the globe. But I want to emphasize in closing that these are, of course, are fundamental issues for the women involved and for their rights, and we should all be concerned and engaged simply on that basis. But also, we have all the evidence that shows, and you all are aware of it, that when women's human rights suffer, all of our other goals suffer as well. The achievement of peace and security and prosperity and development for all are limited when women's human rights are limited. So obviously, hugely important for us to address these trends. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy, for that stark reminder also that women's rights are human rights and all rights are attained equally. And it was a very good overview of the challenges we face. And that gives us an opportunity to focus on one of the largest humanitarian contexts right now. And let me turn to our next speaker, which is Ms. Hala Al-Karib. So Ms. Al-Karib is the Regional Director for the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, established in 1995 with the aim of strengthening women's rights organizations and addressing the subjugation of women and violence against women and girls in the Greater Horn of Africa. She's also the editorial head of the Strategic Initiative's annual journal, Women in Islam, a publication that focuses on gender relations and women's rights within Muslim communities in the Greater Horn of Africa. She often writes on women's rights, social justice issues, and the politics of the region for media outlets such as Open Democracy, Al Jazeera, The New Humanitarian, Pambazuka, and The East African. Ms. Al-Karib studied and worked for the Juba University in South Sudan and as an assistant researcher for the sociology department at the American University in Cairo. So, Ms. Al-Karib, or Hala, if I may, what has been the role of women's groups in the humanitarian response in Sudan, and what is their current role?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about the role of women in Sudan's humanitarian catastrophe that's currently happening. And I would like to start by stressing all the elements that was specifically mentioned by the previous speaker in terms of the catastrophic situations, of women currently in Sudan. The scale of the crisis that Sudanese women are encountering, and I am someone who worked in conflict and post-conflict situation for decades. I don't think I have never seen it. And the lack of support and lack of funding, that Sudanese women are struggling with is also unheard of. Of course, the current campaign of atrocities and violence that's happening in Sudan, it has a gender nature. This war has been fought inside women's home, inside their bedrooms, and it's using their bodies as a war strategy and as a war tool. So the devastation is massive for women and girls and children and civilians. And I can't speak enough about the lack of support for sexual violence victims and survivors, and the lack of access, to any form of help in terms of access to sexual and reproductive health services, or access to mental health and psychosocial support. And in Sudan, we are dealing with a level of devastations where women are killing themselves, either out of fear of being sexually assaulted, or both, they experience the horrific experience of sexual violence. I see how we have documented more than 348, fully documented, more than 348 cases of sexual violence. 90% of those cases are gang rape cases. And this is being said, Sudan is still struggling with having, women in Sudan, they are still struggling having access to, for example, medical services or fistula hospital. So survivors have to travel from one place to another, to find a proper medical services in a very dire situations, and huge and massive insecurity. 23.15% of the cases that we have documented are children's. So underage girls are quite exposed, to sexual violence and other forms of violation that's happening at this point in time. And of course, this is not happening in a vacuum. Women in Sudan has been suffering for over 20 years, as a result of war in Darfur, as a result of impunity and lack of accountability and lack of the commitment of Sudanese subsequent regimes to the issues and challenges of women. Women human rights defenders particularly, and women at the front line, they are subjected to all kinds of violations and harassments and arbitrary detentions. And that's also something that, we are struggling with in terms of, fear and interrogation and intimidations. We have always been seen as the weakest point, and easily being targeted. In terms of women participations in humanitarian response and resilience, it's quite impressive, and it's beyond anybody's imagination, and unfortunately it's often overlooked and not being seen. Women are making life and death decisions in terms of their community's capacity to access food and to access resources, taking care of elders, taking care of course, of children, and so on. But, during wars and conflicts, so typical when food becomes an issue of power, although women, they are contributing to the preparations of food in all the community kitchens, their role in the distributions of food and in deciding, who should be fed first, it's always becoming a challenge. And I'll give an example. In many of the community kitchens we are supporting, we stress, very specific criteria that, children's, older women, women with disabilities, and other vulnerable, community members should have the priority when it comes to being fed. But this is always an area where there is tensions, and it's always end up, that young men are the one who receive food first, vulnerable and fragile, actors, they end up, either they don't receive food, or they receive food last. So access of women to decision making, on humanitarian aid distribution, listening to them, it's something that's really critical, and something that my organization is really paying attention to, especially under the current circumstances. The issue of protections is extremely instrumental, and the role that women are playing in protections, in referral services, in accompanying survivors, and doing that just basically on voluntary basis. It's something that, definitely worth to pay attention to. The urgency of investing on the resilience of women, victims and survivors of sexual violence, and women displaced and women returnees who return to their locations is very, very important. And that is not being happening. Women, we need to invest in strengthening women coping mechanisms on their capacity to continue to support themselves and to support their communities and support their families in a context where we have a large number of women who are women-headed households. Of course, there is massive setbacks when it comes to issues of child marriage, of lack of access to educational institutions, and lack of access to any form of trainings and capacity buildings for underage girls. The conditions of girls below the age of 18 is really dire. One of the lessons that we have learned, and I think it's really important, is we need direct and flexible funding for grassroots organizations to be able to sustain themselves and to collaborate efforts with the women in the community. There is a need to collaborate with women groups and women organizations on the grounds and help them, to and integrate them into the humanitarian aid response. Absolutely, there is a need to support women rights defenders and their protections, which is really critical as they are working in very, very critical situations, and to recognize the role of women, their opinions and their views and their narrative in the political process. Any political process that would not include women, their views, their perspectives in the current conflict, and their views about conflict transformation and resolutions, we will end up just in another political process that will be a preparation for another war. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hala, for sharing those reflections on the experience in Sudan. Very sobering thoughts. I think we would now like to turn to across the globe to another context, which unfortunately I don't think will provide us any more cheer, but I would like to invite Ms. Ulrike Richardson, the Deputy Special Representative for the Secretary General of the United Nations in Haiti, also Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator. Ms. Richardson has more than 30 years of hands-on development, humanitarian, and political experience. She served as the UN Development Coordinator with the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo, and prior to that, she was Resident Coordinator in Cabo Verde, where she manages a response to a catastrophic volcano eruption, and she's also served as the UN Development Program Resident Representative in Gabon and the UNDP Deputy Resident Representative in Turkey and in Cuba. So, Ulrike, if I may, can you tell us how the humanitarian community is currently responding to the pushback of women's rights in Haiti at this moment? Over.
Thank you very much for having me, dear Wendy, and also I would like to greet the panelists, and it's been really, I think, quite eye-opening to listen to the two previous speakers. Yes, in Haiti, as you said, right now the situation in Haiti is not that of a conflict, so we are not in an international armed conflict, but in Haiti it is rather that of armed gangs that hold more or less 85% in control or influence in the capital. And what we've seen, though, is that the impact on women's rights, on women and girls, is very similar to that of an armed conflict. In fact, we have a devastating situation in Haiti. Girls' and women's bodies have become real battlegrounds. There is a hair-raising increase in terms of sexual violence, and most often it is rape, and among that, very much collective rape, even combined with mutilation. And so this is it's very alarming, because the situation in Haiti is that of very weak institutions. It's currently in a political transitional phase. It's been facing years of economic negative growth. It has a very strong women's movement to start with in the 1930s, and that has become, I think, one of our key allies in responding to the situation. And I think that is what for us, what I've seen, and I've been in Haiti now for 3 years, is that we have to be very deliberate. And I think by being very deliberate, we can also be more foresighted. We know that women will become the most affected in any crisis. We see it in natural crisis, and we see it in more violent settings like that in Haiti, or what we just heard from Sudan, for example. So we have to be very deliberate. We have to have a foresight. We need to know that this will be coming. And so that means that we need to build allies. And I think that is the best, in fact, way forward to respond to any type of pushback. We've seen it in the women's movement, and I think celebrating the Beijing this year will, of course, tell us a lot about that. How important it is that we keep on pushing, keep on being deliberate. In Haiti, what we did, we've had a very strong humanitarian response with a very clear focus on not only protection, because it's a protection crisis, with security being so, both the national security being very weak, but also in general for women, there is a very simply the country is not able to protect its population the way that it would like to. And so that's where we have come in to support protection. But in the protection efforts, we have really made a case to work with a specific attention on women and girls. And that also means that we've strengthened our cluster work in terms of protection, but also the GBV cluster to be very much focusing on sexual violence, supporting victims. We, of course, only see a drop we hear of very few cases. I would say it's really the tip of the iceberg. Most of the cases are not being reported to us. But because women they still live with the gang members, they are still caught up in the neighborhoods where gangs hold all the control. They also are being used as revenge against and between gangs. And of course, women, because food insecurity is so rampant, that also means that they have to actually often sell their bodies in order to get food for the table. So there are a lot of similar aspects that we see from countries that have been mentioned so far. But so we've been working a lot on the humanitarian cluster, but we have been also, and this is, I think, is something that I believe is important, is that we work very much across the nexus, meaning the humanitarian development and the peace. In Haiti, we have a political UN mission that, of course, supports very much also gender equality, the participation of women in the political sphere. So we've been involving them in our work. And in fact, what we've been doing is we set out a 5-point action plan with the transitional government, which has been helping us to have women and responding to women's rights and to support to victims of sexual violence, survivors of sexual violence, on top of the agenda. But this 5 action plan has not only been focusing on humanitarian or development, but also on peace. So it's really been able to have these 3 pillar sort of dimensions in one response. And that means not only immediate healthcare, for example, but also working on more long-term psychosocial mental health care, which is extremely important. Also the judiciary, women in Haiti, as everywhere, but it's been very, very vocal about the fact that they want justice. And the justice and the judiciary being so at the root cause of the problems in Haiti. This has been, of course, it's an uphill battle for women, but that's something that is included in our 5-point action plan. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I think this point on working with the women's movement, working with local women organizations, making sure, someone mentioned flexible financing. It's extremely important. And we have to make sure that we align our financing tools with also the Nexus approach and how we support localization and local organizations. And we've been able to draw on SURF, we've been able to draw on a local pool fund, but also development funding. And so I think those aligning these types of political engagement, the humanitarian action that is so important, but also supporting institutions on a more long-term development effort, as well as aligning financing along these three aspects is critical. And of course, across to have a very, very strong partnership with the local women's movement and the political women's movement in any country. And here, of course, I'm talking about Haiti. So I will end here. I have more examples to give, and I guess maybe that can come up also in the Q&A. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Thank you, Ulrika. Just a reminder to all our speakers that we'll ask you to give us your takeaways at the end. I'll come back to you as well, so do keep that in mind. A very sobering situation also in Haiti, unfortunately. Now we will turn to the Middle East, to Syria, and our next speaker is Ms. Wafa Mustafa, Syrian activist, senior communication and advocacy lead at the Syria campaign. Wafa is a former non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and Refugees International. Following her father's forced disappearance by the Assad regime, Wafa fled to Syria and then Turkey in 2013 before completing her studies at the Bard College Berlin in Germany. Wafa's advocacy focuses on the impact of detention and enforced disappearance on women and families, the rights of refugees, and the urgency of international justice and accountability for the crimes of the Assad regime. Wafa is also a member of civil society communities in Syria and across the region. So, Wafa, what is your assessment of the current situation for women in Syria, and what are the greatest risks for women in Syria moving forward?
Thank you so much, Wendy. Maybe let me start by giving a picture of Syria's today. A mother sits in a refugee camp holding onto a fading photograph of the child she lost. And then you also have a woman freed from years of detention, walks out of a prison, but only to find herself in another kind of captivity, unfortunately rejected by her own society. And then you also have families like mine who wakes up every day, despite the fall of the Assad regime, still hunted by the same question, where is our father? And these are not the stories of the past in Syria. These, unfortunately, are the stories of women in Syria today. And of course, they demand action. The fall of the Assad regime has definitely marked the beginning of a new era. It's an era that for all of us carries hope for a different future, hope for change. But for many, many people, and specifically for women, the struggle has not ended, of course. Change, we all know, of course, change does not happen overnight, but the absence of a dictatorship does not automatically bring justice, security, dignity, and freedom. Women who were detained, tortured, or forcibly displaced in Syria, now, of course, they face another battle. Instead of support, they are met with rejection, stigmatized by a society that refuses to see them as survivors. Many have lost their children, and I'm talking here mainly about the detainees and the disappeared. I'm talking about the mothers who have been disappeared by the Assad regime, and their children were taken and given to other families or to orphanages. And unfortunately, someone like Dr. Rania Al-Abbasi, who's a dentist, a Syrian dentist, who was detained with her husband and 6 children in 2013. Till this day, despite the fact that all prisons in Syria have been opened, yet no information about Dr. Rania or her children have been revealed. Meanwhile, organizations supporting these, survivors of detentions and survivors of different crimes in Syria are being abandoned. Funding cuts are forcing them to scale back or even shut down, leaving survivors without the legal aid, mental health support, and protection they desperately need today more than ever. After everything they've endured, Syrians, women in Syria, are left to fend for themselves again. For families of the disappeared, there is no closure. Yes, almost all prisons in Syria were opened, but unfortunately, documentation say that at least 112,000 people remain missing till this day. The regime's fall has not answered the burning question for millions of Syrians. Where are our fathers, our husbands, and our sons? My own father was kidnapped and forcibly disappeared by the Assad regime in July 2013. And for the past 12 years, me and my family have done nothing in our lives but fighting on daily basis to have answers and to save my father. While we live in this agony of not knowing, the future remains very, very difficult. And for women in the camps, unfortunately, and camps in Syria are still, hosting millions of people. Survival remains a daily battle. Aid is vanishing. Women-headed households are facing economic devastation, displacement, and worsening insecurity. Last month, 18 women were killed in a car bombing in the city of Manbij. Landmines continue to claim lives across the country. No religion, no background. Everyone is a fair game, unfortunately, and no one has been spared. Talking about the present and the future, I think and I believe requires reflecting on the past as well. For years, Syrian civilians, and especially women, have been failed by the UN, by the UN agencies. The world watched as the Assad regime manipulated humanitarian aid to tighten his grip on civilians. And there was no real response to the mass disappearances and torture of thousands of people. Initiatives like the UN Independent Institution on Missing Persons and the International Impartial Independent Mechanism, IIIM, and the Commission of Inquiry must be acknowledged, of course. But for millions of Syrians on the ground, the UN aid agencies have enabled Assad for years. The failure was repeated again in 2023 after the devastating earthquake that happened in Syria and Turkey. First responders in Syria were left to fend for themselves, while UN agencies unfortunately remained absent for the first period. As a human rights group, the Syria Campaign, my organization, believes that Syria is entitled to support that aligns with the aspiration of our people. The women of Syria are continuously excluded from the very system that should be protecting them. So the risks in Syria today for women remain dire, of course, with the fate of the disappeared unresolved, political exclusion continuing, and economic devastation, leaving women vulnerable to poverty and exploitation. Additionally, of course, and most importantly, the vanishing of humanitarian aid has exposed and still exposing women to increased violence, trafficking, and death. What must be done is the thing that I would like to conclude with. Syria's women must be at the center of Syria's future. And here, I'm not only talking about the new government, I'm also talking about the UN agencies, and I'm talking about the international community. And women should not be included as token representatives, because this is something we've experienced for years. We should be included as decision makers, shaping policy about justice, truth, and humanitarian responses. Accountability for disappearances must be a priority. The world and the international community must push for truth and justice and the release of those who are still detained. Humanitarian aid must be reformed. It cannot continue to be a tool of political manipulation, and aid must reach those who desperately need it, especially women. At last, women's voices must be heard and must be centered. The international community must stop ignoring the voices of women, activists, and grassroots organizations. Despite all these challenges, women in Syria are not silent, and they're not just isolated. They're working day and night for the change and for the future that we deserve. And the question to me remains, to those of you here and in other places sitting in these halls of power and having the ability to stand by the women of Syria and support their resilience, will you use it? Because Syria's women, I assure you, they did not stop and they did not keep silent while the bombs were falling on over their heads, and while their husbands and their families and their loved ones have been detained and killed under torture. And I assure you, they will not keep silent today as well. So the question is, we won't accept we won't accept your silence anymore. What are you going to do about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Wafa, for sharing such compelling stories and also your specific asks for action. After hearing such horrific and devastating examples from many contexts, I'm hoping that we can hear a little bit of what we can do about it. And I want to turn to Ms. Naradzai Gumbanjanda, the Deputy Executive Director for UN Women. So, Didi Nyarzai, welcome. So you're bringing to us more than 35 years of experience in development, human rights, peace, and security, with a focus on women's empowerment, gender equality, and women's and children's rights. Your personal experience growing up in a resource-poor and war-ravaged community, I understand, drives your passion to ensure that all women and girls and their families fully enjoy their rights. You've previously served as the Chief Executive of Rosaria Memorial Trust, founded in memory of your mother, which has supported girls and women in Zimbabwe rural communities since 2007 through innovative initiatives that promote education, health, and entrepreneurship. Ms. Gumbanjanda was appointed as the first African Union Goodwill Ambassador on ending child marriage, and in this capacity, you've paved the way for the African Union Convention on Violence Against Women and Girls, which was passed in 2023. So, Nyarzai, we'd love to hear from you about the push forward strategy and how it can be applied in humanitarian settings, especially where women's rights are visibly regressing.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Just listening to Wafa and Hala and Ulrika and saying, this is it. Silence is not an option. Silence is not an option when we face the issues that we face. And I want to say thank you so much for co-hosting today with us at UN Women, and Wendy for the excellent facilitation. Just to add one extra dimension to my life, as I then share a few points on how we can continue to push forward. As you said, I was born during the war. At times, I get angry, and I could feel the emotions. I could feel Wafa. I could feel Hala's contribution. Hala, good to see you again. Ulrika, we were together a few weeks ago when you presented on Haiti. The situation of women and gender equality in humanitarian situations is not about statistics, or it's about life and pain and opportunities and possibilities. At times, I feel that the numbers, the challenge of just talking the numbers, for me, one woman raped is one too many. One girl dropping out of school because of humanitarian crisis is one too many. Because these things are preventable. Whether it's a climate-induced crisis, whether it's gangs in Haiti, whether it's conflict, whether it's lack of democracy, these are preventable causes. This can be mitigated. So we really need, on this International Women's Day, for us, this is the first push forward, is to speak strongly and clearly to what the issues are. When the UN was established, it was on the ashes of the Second World War. And it is there that we start with our push forward strategy, with a clarity that the UN Charter itself is about rights, it's about peace, it's about development. The nexus we are talking about is that nexus which is in the UN Charter. And it is also very clear that it is about we, the people. In our diversities and in our multiplicity of contexts, including in the humanitarian space. And within that is a very clear commitment to non-discrimination and a very clear commitment to multilateralism. I emphasize non-discrimination because the pushback and regression we are seeing today is giving a sense that discrimination can still be allowable on certain grounds, when actually the core ethos of humanity is that no discrimination should be allowed. And secondly, that it is about multilateralism, the collective responsibility of member states and communities to humanity. But what we see as part of this pushback that we have in the regression is the resurgence of nationalism and national interest, which defies or claws back on the essence of multilateralism. But for us to effectively respond to humanitarian situation, we must really strengthen multilateralism. So on the eve of the, as we celebrate already the, and observe at times, I'm not sure we celebrate the Beijing Platform for Action having been adopted, but we also observe the progress and the regressions that we have. So this conversation is very timely. In terms of how we move forward, also, a couple of key recommendations. First is that advancing gender equality, the rights and empowerment of women and girls is not an ideology. It is a principle-based position in international law. It is very important that we continue to claim the power of and the responsibilities that lie within the agreed instruments at international level, at national level in our countries, and within which we have the Interagency Standing Committee, and of course our gender policy there. It's really rooted in the principles of the United Nations. It's rooted in the agreements that have been reached by the member states. Therefore, that is a major clawback that we are seeing, and we must continue to insist and build on those international principles. I'm very encouraged to see the negotiations that are going on the political declaration on CSW 69 to say, despite the very strong regressions that we see in some of the voices in the negotiations, we also see the majority of member states really standing up and saying, we commit to gender equality, to women's rights, to the empowerment of women. So we look forward to that political declaration and to the next 2 weeks of CSW as part of a robust global multilateral system standing up very clearly and very strongly and very confidently to pushing forward on gender equality. It is also very important, as you have all raised, that it's about communities. Communities. It is about really delivering and supporting at the local level. We know community is protection. Community and local interventions is resilience, build resilience. We know that is where women-led initiatives are and which are part of the healing. Hala, the point you raised on all the work that you do within SIA. It is also women-led community interventions which are about access to services, the diversity of services that we see. Therefore, pushing forward demands a very strong increased support to funding flows to local organizations as a critical way of also ensuring that the voices on the ground, the experiences are informing the solutions. As UN Women, we have learned very strongly. We are on the ground through both our UN Violence Against Women Trust Fund and the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund. And it's still said that the percentage, we have less than 1% of humanitarian funding going to local women's organizations. And this is not acceptable. But we are also very excited to have very strong leaders like Ulrika there, Inge, really mobilizing the UN system at country level to say, why can't we build much stronger focus around funding and maybe have a spotlight 3 in countries for us to be able to resource this work. So that is also encouraging, but at the same time, we are saying the local is global and the global is local, and change must happen at the country levels in the communities. It is also important as a recommendation of pushing forward that we shift language. And we really, really look at positioning what is called life-saving. The notion of life-saving has excluded sexual and gender-based violence-related interventions. is excluding issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights. But we know the statistics of mortalities of women, the issues of mental health, of trauma, that one rape is an experience one lives with for the rest of their lives. And also they may actually be at risk of getting infected with STIs and other causes. And yet there is an exclusion to responses and interventions relating to sexual and gender-based violence or reproductive health and rights as life-saving. And we really hope that this would be an issue that we continue to advocate for together. The question of participation has been raised, and of course, we hear is often the issues around nothing about us without us. This is the moment where we really need to strengthen the effective, full, and meaningful inclusion and participation, which is more than just attending meetings, but actually being on the decision making. This year, we celebrate Resolution 1325's 25th anniversary. Let's build on that momentum to move together to address the issues around participation. Data is important, evidence is important, and just as I said earlier on, it's not about just the quantitative numbers, it's also the story behind the violation or the experience of one woman. So let's continue to tell the stories. Citizen journalism is important. National statistics and data is important. Building a robust framework for our interventions is critical. I dream, and I do. I hope, and we do at UN Women. That's why we exist. That we will have a world in which women can enjoy, can access, enjoy their human rights, and that those rights are protected, not just in law, but also in practice. That equality cannot just exist in the books, but equality can be substantive equality. And that empowerment is about providing and supporting the knowledge, skills, and experiences of women. Again, thank you so much, Wendy, and back to you. We are looking forward to celebrating and observing and using this year as the year for pushing forward the agenda for gender equality, for women's rights and women's empowerment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nyaradza, for that call to action. Now the floor is open for questions. Please feel free to add them in the chat. As a reminder, please keep them short and clear to allow for enough time for answers. I have two discussants first who I'd like to invite to react to the panel. First, I'd like to invite from the Latin America region, Ms. Genesis Bustillo, who is the project coordinator for improving health and gender care with Doctors of the World in Spain. Genesis, please share your reflections from the panel and how it relates to your experience in Central America. And feel free, again, as we mentioned earlier, si es mejor que hables en español, I can help translate. It's up to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Bueno, realmente los contextos que mencionan de Haití, Sudán, Siria, son contextos, aunque situaciones diferentes a lo que vivimos en Honduras, pero son situaciones que sufrimos las mujeres muy parecidas.
Wait, hold on. Let me translate while you go. So Genesis was saying that the situations that were mentioned today, Sudan, Syria, and Haiti, while they're different, there are also some elements that are very similar to what is happening right now in Honduras.
Bueno, el contexto humanitario en Honduras es totalmente diferente, ya que tenemos situaciones de grupos armados por pandillas. Adicional a eso, la situación del cambio climático que afecta bastantes situaciones ante ciertas situaciones de desastres naturales.
So it's different in the sense that they are facing with armed groups and also climate change and natural disasters in Honduras.
Al tener esta dinámica un poco diferente, las mujeres tenemos ciertas dificultades, ya que no tenemos una política pública que proteja a las mujeres ante estas situaciones. Entonces, esto genera muchas brechas para que las mujeres puedan acceder a ciertos servicios básicos.
Without public policy, there's been many gaps for women to be able to access some basic services in facing these challenges.
Y así como lo comentaban las colegas que presentaron anteriormente, tenemos muchos casos de violencia sexual en los alojamientos temporales. Al no tener una política que permita el aborto legal en nuestro país, estas mujeres tienen que sufrir y llevar un embarazo a cabo producto de una violencia sexual.
So there has been lots of sexual violence, in particular in communal shelters, and there is no legal access to abortion, so many women are forced to bring those pregnancies to term.
Adicional a esto, en estos espacios de alojamientos temporales o en estas comunidades hay altos niveles de violencia basada en género hacia las mujeres. Esto evita que estas mujeres puedan acceder a servicios de salud sexual y reproductiva.
And also in temporary shelters, there's lots of GBV, gender-based violence, and women do not have access to sexual and reproductive health services.
Toda esta situación anexado al conflicto político, conflicto armado y conflicto por el cambio climático hace que haya un aumento en el impacto de la salud mental de estas personas. Eso ha hecho que en los últimos años tengamos un aumento de suicidios en adolescentes, niñas y mujeres.
So this combined political violence, conflict, and displacement because of climate change, also lack of access to services and increased poverty has led to an increase of suicides among children and adolescents and teenagers.
Toda esta situación hace que todas estas mujeres tengan diferentes necesidades de protección que lamentablemente no pueden ser suplidas ni por los gobiernos locales ni por el gobierno nacional. Eso hace que las organizaciones, tanto agencias de la ONU como organizaciones no gubernamentales, tengamos que trabajar para que esas personas puedan acceder a estos mecanismos de protección.
So unfortunately, there's a lack of protection for women and access to services, as was mentioned previously. Neither local nor national governments have the capacity to respond to these needs, and therefore the gap is being filled by the United Nations and by NGOs providing these services.
Y no quería dejar pasar por alto la emergencia que tenemos actualmente en los últimos 2 meses de las mujeres retornadas, ¿verdad? Es una situación muy compleja. Actualmente estas mujeres retornadas son víctimas y sobrevivientes de violencia sexual, pero también de trata y explotación sexual en su retorno desde Estados Unidos o México a Honduras.
In the last 2 months, there's been a major crisis with returned migrants who have been exploited, and they've been trafficked. They've been victim of sexual exploitation. Yes.
Y bueno, para terminar, solo comentarles que como país no tenemos una política o en el marco de la ley algo que pueda proteger a estas mujeres retornadas con esas necesidades de protección. Son mujeres retornadas, usualmente madres solteras, que vienen con un gran impacto en la salud mental y actualmente no tenemos mecanismos de una reintegración para ellas a la sociedad, así que eso está generando bastantes retos.
Yes.
Muchas gracias, Wendy.
Thanks, Janice. So she concluded by saying, the women that were returned from the United States, from Mexico, from other locations, often they were victims of sexual violence themselves already before being returned. And so they have mental health needs and they have sexual health needs. And these services, unfortunately, there's no legal framework for them to access those services. And so that is a big gap in what is humanitarian needs right now in Honduras. So thank you, Genesis, for sharing also this sobering story from what's happening in Honduras. I have another discussant. It is Jennifer Miquel, the head of external relations from the United Nations Populations Fund Humanitarian Response Division. So Jennifer, please, your reactions to the panel and your additions. Jennifer, I think you're still on mute. Or you have, yes, unmute, please.
No voice.
Still not.
Can you?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, sorry for that. Let me just say thank you for convening this crucial briefing and for giving UNFPA the floor. I wanted to take this opportunity to underscore the devastating impact that the global pushback on sexual reproductive health and rights is having on women and girls living in crisis settings. Humanitarian crises often weaken or even shatter health systems, leading to staggeringly high rates of maternal mortality. 6 in 10 maternal deaths occur in fragile settings, and these are deaths which are largely preventable with access to skilled healthcare. In emergencies, access to essential sexual reproductive health services is disrupted, cutting women off from life-saving services, including safe childbirth, treatment for sexual transmitted diseases such as HIV, and access to contraception, depriving them of their right to make informed choices about their bodies and lives. Pregnancies and childbirth do not pause in times of crisis, and nor should access to quality life-saving care. Medical treatment and counseling services are vital for women and girls who have suffered sexual violence, including rape, assault, and trafficking. And last year, funding for prevention and treatment of gender-based violence fell woefully short. Overall, the GBV ask was only 30% funded. And this year, the funding gap is likely to skyrocket as the humanitarian sector faces its worst ever funding crisis, as we know. This year alone, more than 92 million people, the majority of whom are women and girls, need support because they are at risk of or have experienced gender-based violence. That's almost a 10% increase compared to last year. And addressing these challenges requires unwavering political commitment and sustained predictable funding, both of which are quickly vanishing. Today, women's autonomy over their own bodies is under attack, and the alarming rollbacks on sexual and reproductive health and rights is reversing hard-won progress and costing lives in the process. UNFPA will not compromise on women's rights. We really remain resolute, ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health services and addressing gender-based violence in humanitarian settings is non-negotiable. We stand firm in our commitment to responding and working alongside our partners to deliver these life-saving services. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd now like to turn to the floor, and I saw that we have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'd like to invite our panelists to reply. So maybe the first one, Ulrika, if you're still with us, there was a question regarding the work in Haiti and your mention of the programs that span peace, development, and humanitarian sectors, and the question about how do we also incorporate human rights and accountability into that framework? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's a very good question. In fact, we have one of the specialities in Haiti in terms of our humanitarian response is that the protection cluster is chaired by OHCHR. And that means that that actually facilitates having human rights at the center of our response. And what I also been consistently doing is to support human rights through part of, let's say, investments from the SURF, for example. So I think that we've been able to very much integrate it. The 5-point action plan that we worked on and that we have agreed with a broad range of actors actually also includes justice, to include supporting, let's say, specialized tribunals to be able to better respond to the issue around to women survivors of sexual violence, so that you have specialized units that can actually provide justice. This has not started yet. And the judiciary in Haiti is very weak, but we hope that within actually months we can be able to have the first cases addressed through these specialized tribunals. But just to say that human rights is very much at the center, and I believe that it would be, well, in my experience, it's impossible to address humanitarian development without actually integrating human rights. And I just would like to say to our dear friend from UN Woman that it's, you know, what she said, that, you know, women's human rights and the situation that the whole conundrum that we've been talking about, the tragedies this morning that we've been talking about, is really not about ideology. This is very much settled into the Charter of the United Nations. It's settled in humanitarian and human rights law. So for me, and humanitarian principles and international law. So we're not really talking about an ideology here. And also the whole notion around life-saving. Yes, we know that funding for humanitarian action is shrinking. It's we don't, and Haiti is certainly not part of the most well-funded, but we see it across the board. So I think that of course we have to then be firmer in terms of how do we actually define it. But I think that also then calls for a stronger emphasis on an integrated approach, where we make sure that development, that peace, judiciary comes into our response. We do not have the luxury, nor the time. Women do not have the time to just act on sort of one dimension. We need to have a multidimensional approach. Our crisis today, we listen to all the examples today, including from Honduras. It's multidimensional crises. And we are not only dealing with one set of tragedies, we actually dealing with several and a multitude. So that requires a very multidimensional response. Over from my side. Thank you. And it's a very good question, by the way. So yes, thank you, Wendy.
I'm not sure, Peggy, did you want to add anything to that?
I just want to, now I'm having a problem with my mute. I just want to say thank you, Ulrika. I agree with everything she put on the table and strongly support that recognition of the integrated approach and what needs to happen. And Haiti is a good example of it, as she said, where we are participating as much in the humanitarian country team as we do in the overall UN country team and lead the protection cluster as noted. So we are very engaged in activities there, like training civil society and the police. And we did a report recently on sexual violence used as a tactic to control and gain territory. So, looking across those pieces is very important, and working with our partners to do it is essential. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I would now like to actually give the next question to Nyarzai, which is about the current political and economic environment. How can we ensure that any reprioritization of budgets that is currently happening still manages to uphold the commitments to gender equality and empowerment of women, including participation, and as you mentioned, the need to channel resources to women's groups, and especially local women's groups and civil society? Nyarzai, can you come in? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. I was still muted. Thank you for that great question. For me, there are three things. One is we must have the courage to name what is in front of us. When the world in the data that we have as the UN, just looking at the 2023 data, which was telling us that $4.3 trillion was spent on military expenditure. Yeah. That's 2023. We can expect the trillions are going even much higher in 2025. But at the same time, you have over 100 million girls dropping out of school. And you have less than 1% of funding to gender equality in humanitarian setting. The question is not that there is less money. The question is around prioritization and where decisions are made and what is prioritized. And I think that is one aspect we need to discuss and we need to raise. I've often, and we in the UN and all of us here are often asked, how do we end gender-based violence in conflict? I'm like, trillions of dollars is creating violence and structural violence against women. And then we have a few shillings, a few coins to support survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. It's a contradiction. We must name the contradictions as part of the push forward in the first place. Equally, I'm an African woman, and I know my Africa is not poor. I was working on child marriage, and it was very painful to be seeing the highest cases of rape. What we are calling child marriage is rape of our girls near the mines. The mines are generating billions of dollars, and girls are getting raped. Whether we look even just in the recent DRC scenario, So the question is that not that the world has no resources, it's how those resources are managed, are prioritized, and are actually offering protection. So I think for me, that's the first big issues around military expenditure, around prioritization of available resources for us to have human security, and which then through that human security, we're able to prevent violence, support survivors, have access to education, and the other point that is that you raise in the question is with the available resources. It's sad. It's actually sad to see public policy saying we are actually cutting funding or reducing funding to life-saving interventions, which are trying to address the core of the inequalities, but also to empower women and girls. So I hope that the governments would review and reverse those who have reduced their funding for us to have more sustained support, because investing in women and girls, investing in gender equality is about actually building stronger economies. It's also a right in and by itself without instrumentalizing what the benefit would be. The third piece that it calls us to do is to be efficient amongst ourselves as a sector in the humanitarian sector. How can we be more effective and efficient and more collaborative in the work that we do? What are those interventions which would say we really need a strong support to UNHCR for them to be able to do the work that they need to do because they have the mandate to deliver on certain issues? How do we strengthen the UN system response on SRH and maternal health and the work that UNFPA would be doing? So stronger coherence, including within the UN system itself. And this is where, as UN Women, our coordination mandate is very critical, but also the work with civil society organizations. And how do we also ensure stronger support? And with the little resources that are available, it was very painful last 3 weeks. Last 3 weeks has been very painful. As I saw colleagues, I was running a shelter, and colleagues would call us and say, you know what, Nyaradzai, we no longer have, there's been a freeze in funding. So it means we cannot pay rent. It also means we are not able to do emergency response to support somebody who needs to go to a shelter or to a clinic. That's what we are talking about. How can we have stronger coordination on the resources available? How can we work differently in order to be efficient with what we have so that we remain very committed on delivery and protection and rights, and at the same time continue to address the bigger macro issues that are confronting us. And also accountability of the private sector. We also need accountability of the private sector and other actors who operate in humanitarian settings so that there is total accountability throughout the ecosystem and resourcing and working with women's rights organizations and supporting the human rights defenders, because they even become much more vulnerable when we are in a crisis like we are in. The human rights defenders whom I heard this morning on this panel even requires much more support. So we also need prioritizing of the human rights defenders and the peace advocates in crisis situations. Thank you, and over to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Nyaradzai. I think we have a time for one last question, and it is from the chat. Rehab asks how we can ensure human rights are upheld through an integrated approach, enhancing women's political participation, economic empowerment, and engagement of civil society organizations. She would love to hear the thoughts of the panelists on how to advance human rights through political and economic inclusion. And I think we could get some country examples from our speakers. So maybe if you might, I'd like to invite Wafa first to see maybe she can say what's happening in the Syria context, and then Hala. Yep.
Thank you. I think, I mean, this is the, you know, this is the question, right? Like this is the question we all have. This is the question that, you know, millions of us everywhere are struggling with on daily basis. And as I said in my earlier intervention, I think that there is not like a catalog where we have answers for these questions. And what's very, very fascinating is that despite all the challenges, despite all the horrors, and despite all the crimes that women in Syria and of course in other contexts have been subjected to, they're still fighting, and they don't accept to give up and to be isolated and to keep silent. And I mean, at least in Syria, like let me maybe say a few things. I like, despite of course the Assad regime has fell, but has been toppled, and of course the first few weeks were like very, very chaotic, but Syrian women and women of Syria did not accept to just sit at home, or unfortunately many of them don't even have homes, they're in camps. They did not accept to just like be isolated and not be part of any kind of process that has been that is being formulated today. So Syrian women are pushing so hard, because we all know very, very well that usually the margin we have, we're not given that margin. We fight for it, and we struggle for it, and we give everything we have for it, and usually many of us, unfortunately, all over the planet give their lives for this margin, to be part of shaping the future and the present of our countries. And I would say, like, I mean, the women I know in my life on daily basis, the women I talk to from the camps, those who were forcibly displaced inside Syria, those who were who had to flee the country to Europe and other places, mothers of the disappeared, former detainees, women who survived the Assad's prisons. They're fighting in their own ways. They're fighting to not only be part of the political process and to like reclaim their rights and women's rights, and make sure that any new constitution for this country will give us our rights, and will allow us to play the role we have been playing for the past years. Women in Syria have been taking this leadership role in the past years, despite fighting against one of the most brutal dictatorships, which is the Assad dictatorship. But I also think, to be honest, that this is a moment of change, and in the tools we have in Syria, we're using everything we can. We're dedicating our lives and our efforts and our energies. And of course, we're fighting today. Where like it's a very big, very chaotic phase. We have a government that has a not very bright history when it comes to human rights, to women's rights, and to freedom of speech and all of that. But at the same time, I think the third crucial actor in this equation is the international community. What is the international community going to do about this? We have been failed during the past 14 years. And I want to say that this is a chance for all of us. Syrian women are doing their best, and this is the chance, not only for the UN and the UN agencies, for the international community, and for all states and all international mechanisms and institutions. This is your chance, because when things change in Syria, this change is not limited to Syria. It will be transmitted to other contexts. And I think I just want to conclude by saying that this leads us to I think one of the main things that we've been struggling with in the past years is impunity. Impunity is infectious. The Assad regime was not held accountable for its crimes. And that also was applied to many other contexts. So when change starts somewhere, it definitely goes beyond that, and it reaches all of us.
Thank you, Wafa. Hala, I'd like to invite you to also respond to that question, if you have some examples of how we are empowering civil society organizations in Sudan.
Thank you very much. The truth of the matter is that working at the front as women rights defenders, this is a very lonely route, I have to say, particularly during Sudan conflict. The level of interrogations, that women rights defenders and harassments are experiencing is beyond anyone's imaginations. The online trolling, the threats that we are experiencing, the attacks on our credibility for reporting what we see and what we hear from women at the grassroots level. the assumptions that, the conversations about the violations that women are experiencing, can be utilized by each of the warring parties and each of those who are contesting power is highly problematic. And the fact that women rights defenders at the front lines, what's happening to them, grassroots women rights defenders, the fact that they are subjected to sexual violence. We have documented a large number of cases, women rights defenders who were working with us, but they became ultimately themselves victims of sexual violence and victims of enforced disappearances. And the responsibility lies on our shoulder, but the other actors within the human rights community are not stressing this. The history of Sudan politics, that the violence against women and sexual violence against women is a collateral damage, and it should be brushed away. When people speaks about politics, when people speaks about issues of governance, and unfortunately, that kind of discourse and that kinds of narratives, the international community, to a large extent, sometimes is part of it, and so it's difficult road, acting as women rights defenders in this situation. The minimal investments in terms of supporting women rights defenders on the ground and their protections is also one of the biggest crises that we are encountering. So, but as I said, we have been in these situations many times in Sudan and in other countries across the Horn of Africa and across the continent. We understand really well that unless matters of justice, matters of accountability, has been addressed fundamentally, there will not be peace in our countries.
Thank you, Hala. We only have a few minutes left, and I did say that I wanted to give you all a chance to share with us your final takeaways or parting thoughts, or maybe coming back to some of the questions. So first, I'd like to invite Nyaradzai to share with us. You have just a few sentences of reflection for final takeaways, and then after that, I will go to the other panelists.
Such deep issues that colleagues have raised. I think the first for me is accountability of the international community, and our responsibility as part of that international community is the UN. And to also say, when we say the international community, maybe we also need to continue to break that down further, because then we are talking about the agencies and programs and funds, but we are also talking about the member states as a collective. And we're also talking about regional bodies. So Hala, listening to you, in my mind was, okay, so how do we really need to step up in terms of the work that we do with the African Union, and which is a peace and security agenda with the Arab League. And so I think that aspect of really breaking down this big group called the international community, for us to see the levels of accountability and where the action lies is very important. The other issue that you raised is that responding to gender equality in humanitarian crisis is a justice issue. It's not a charity. It's not about charity. It's about justice. That has been raised severally, and we really look forward to the CSW Bureau adopting the program of work, for which there would be one of the priorities in the coming years is around justice and violence against women. We feel this is a critical issue that we should talk about, impunity. Just like we are talking about pushing forward on funding, we also need to say, how is it that we need to deepen the focus on justice and addressing impunity? I used to enjoy being a lawyer and a criminal justice lawyer. And so at times I just say we need really to insist on the issues around justice, and it's good to see in the draft political declarations that are there a very clear focus around justice and the importance of bringing perpetrators to account, because that's what we need to do. Thank you so much, and back to you, Wendy. It has been a wonderful session, and I want to appreciate also an extraordinary community and network that we have, and the support from UN Women colleagues also in Geneva. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'd now like to hand the floor to Ulrika for her parting thoughts.
Yes. So justice, and I agree very much that justice is at the core. The challenge here is that very often, at least in Haiti, and I would imagine in Haiti, a weak judiciary, in fact, even often absent currently, and also that means impunity, widespread impunity, corruption, is part of the root causes, right? So I think it is absolutely an imperative that we address root causes as we address also the humanitarian needs at an immediate level. So I think those two, being able to have and I always say we have to have the mental presence to be able to work on several priorities at the same time, and using the tools that we have available to us. The tools are not perfect, and we can certainly improve them. But if we work in an integrated fashion, without losing the attention on the different pillars in that integrated approach, then I think that we will have a better chance to address and particularly respond to victims and survivors of sexual violence, and to also be able to push forward on women's rights. So I think for that, the integrated approach, the fact of not losing sight of justice is so important, even though we can't always count on the judiciary in a country, but we can normally work. There is always, we've seen that in Haiti, extraordinary members of the judiciary who wants nothing else than moving forward, connecting with the women's movement, connecting with those, that from the 30s were active on fighting for women's rights. So I think, we need to have that whereabout to be able to move really forward, taking into consideration so many issues. And it's not impossible. I think the most beautiful here is actually that it is possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Ulrika.
And just one more thing for me is the collective responsibility. When we talk about the international community, we talk about the communities, community-based approach, and working with local women organizations. When we talk about a collective responsibility, that's very true. But that doesn't mean that we can diminish the individual responsibility of each actor. It has to be that it makes our resolve stronger, not that we sort of dilute responsibility because it's a collective. So if we can turn that into really a sort of a massive responsibility instead of a diluted one, then I think we are certainly on a better track. So thanks a lot for this conversation, and yes, it's not impossible, but we can never let our fight sort of diminish in this sense. Over.
Thank you, Ulrika, for that reminder of the collective responsibility. Wafa, perhaps a soundbite or a couple inspiring call to action for us as your parting thoughts.
Thank you. I mean, to be honest, I have just a few things in mind that I maybe want to say. I mean, I definitely think that, as I said again, impunity is infectious, and when it starts somewhere, it does not stop there. And thus, solidarity and intersectionality are also infectious. So I think that, to be honest, in our work, we should not look at, women's rights or women's situation in certain contexts as separate from each other. And in that sense, I think that, for us, I know very well that Syrian women and women of Syria have been learning a lot and have been, reaching out and building bridges with other women from different contexts, learning from them, but also exchanging expertise and knowledge and tools. And in that same fashion, I also think that the international community and the international organizations can and should do the same, because when we're of course the situation is very, very desperate and we're all aware of it, we live it on daily basis, but change needs to start somewhere. And I think, as I said also in my earlier remarks, changing the present to a better present and a better future should start with reflecting on the past. And I think we haven't been there yet, and we should definitely reflect on the past and reflect on our tools and our mechanisms and the way we dealt with victims and with survivors and with the people of these contexts.
Thank you, Wafa. I know we're at time, but please bear with us a couple more minutes. I want to hear from Hala and then Peggy for our closing remarks. So, Hala, over to you.
Very quickly, invest on women rights defenders and invest on grassroots women groups, women at the front line, their resilience and their capacity. This has not been happening at all since the beginning of the war. The investments on the resilience, on the sustainability of civil activisms and women movements. We have been celebrated in 2019 that we protested, we brought a dictatorship down, but then when the conflict started, the support for women rights defenders and activists at the front line inside Sudan, has been extremely minimal. And it's critical, to sustain the agenda, to sustain our capacity, to continue push for justice, for accountability, and for protections of women, and, for potential peace and conflict transformations is, to continue to start to seriously and strategically investing on the resilience of women activists and rights defenders on the grounds inside Sudan and inside refugee camps.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hala. Peggy, over to you for some final thoughts.
Thanks. And very quickly, just 4 points. I want to pick up the point about funding because it's obviously central. Nobody has a magic wand we're going to wave to solve this. I don't think just making the same arguments we've always made is going to solve the problem either. I do think, though, that we have the possibility to use this moment to really push the issue around burden sharing amongst our donors. They're all facing cuts, but if they work on it together rather than each come up with their own strategies, it will really help us. So we should all jointly make them do better in terms of how they are giving money. And secondly, we've got the evidence about how investment now saves money later. We are working in a pragmatic world. We have to put that front and center and do more of that. On this issue around protection, I think that is absolutely crucial. We have to make sure that protection remains central as stipulated in the protection policy and is within the guidance for humanitarian coordinators. We can't allow it to be sidelined for things that are so-called more life-saving than protection. It's on our part, we'll continue to monitor and report on that as the basis for the work that's going to be done. And we need enhanced cooperation with humanitarian actors across the field in prioritizing that protection as well. But I also take up the point third of what Ulrich said about making sure that we are also looking at root causes. We're doing a lot more work right now on economic and social rights, and it's an area where women have an incredibly important role to play, and women's rights are very important. And I do think that if we look more at inequalities and discrimination in different ways, it helps us to get to the answers we're looking for. And then just finally, I want to pick up the points that Hala and Nazira made around human rights defenders. Ultimately, none of us are going to solve this problem on our own. It is the women and girls and those who support them working on the ground who are going to make real change happen here. So the more we can invest in protecting those who are defending rights, be they in community organizations or in human rights organizations or in women's rights organizations or in disability rights organizations across the spectrum. Those are the people who are going to make the change happen. And we need all of us to prioritize making sure that they are safe to do that work and that they're funded to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is, we come to the end of our briefing on women's rights in humanitarian crises. And I want to thank you all for your participation in our event today. I want to specifically thank our co-organizers, the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights and UN Women. I'd also like to give a shout out to my team that co-organized the briefing, Rolinda and Sandra here next to me. The briefing highlighted the systematic oppression of women globally, with our examples coming from Sudan, Syria, Haiti, even Honduras, demonstrating how severe restrictions on women's rights are at odds with humanitarian principles, impede humanitarian efforts, and cause prolonged humanitarian crises and conflict dynamics. I think we can all draw from today's rich discussion and look at the priorities that we have to work on collectively over the next few months, years, and into the future. We have these key priorities in our call to action to urgently galvanize, push forward for rights, equality, and justice, and building on the advocacy of women's rights organizations, amplifying their practices and positive momentum in our communities and countries, both by those who protect rights and those who hold them. We need to create multi-stakeholder alliances, find the space for inclusive dialogue and intergenerational, intersectional solidarity, and document and analyze what is working. So there are good examples to point to, and there's also so much more to be accomplished. And so I hope we can join together and commit to these priorities as we move forward, united in our dedication to creating a more resilient and responsive humanitarian action. Thanks again to all our speakers. Thank you, Peggy, Hala, Wafa, Ulrika, and Nyaradze. The briefing as it has been recorded. I hope you can share and post it online once we'll have it on our IASC website and on our LinkedIn page. Please do follow us on our social media handles that you'll see in the chat and join us for further updates and briefings. And I also want to encourage you all to join the International Women's Day celebrations on the 8th of March, wherever you are. Do form part of this international solidarity around women's rights. Thank you again. Thanks to all our speakers. Bravo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci, au revoir.
Thank you.
Thank you.